Hello all, sorry I couldn't be there in person today. My name is Emily, and today I'll be presenting to you some of my experimental results on the spatial structure and expansion dynamics of laser-produced cerium plasmas. This work leverages laser-produced plasmas, or LPPs, created through the process of laser ablation to detect actinides in the environment and study the properties of nuclear fireballs. Optical techniques have been used to detect uranium in the environment for years, and as for the last decade, significant research has been performed on studying the physical and chemical properties of laser-produced uranium plasmas to provide insights into the complex processes driving the evolution of nuclear fireballs. Of particular interest in this work are the chemical reactions that occur within the nuclear fireball. It is known that molecular species formation is greatly influenced by the environment, and that this can considerably impact fallout particle formation and debris distribution. However, while extensive research has been performed with uranium laser-produced plasmas, the literature is severely lacking on plutonium LPP circuits. As far as I am aware, there is only a single paper that has been published on the oxidation chemistry of plutonium laser-produced plasmas, and it's relatively surface level. Essentially, the authors go in, they perform laser ablation and laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy on a plutonium sample, and they identify what appear to be oxide bands in the visible spectrum, yet they are not able to identify what molecular transitions are associated with those bands. My work aims to address these gaps in knowledge by developing optical signatures of plutonium using cerium LPP circuits. Cerium is a common plutonium circuit due to similarities in electronic, thermodynamic, and chemical properties. The main focus of this research is to gain a higher understanding of the high-temperature gas phase oxidation chemistry of cerium and plutonium LPPs and nuclear fireballs, where the mixing process of the plasma plume with the surrounding environment and the plume's hydrodynamics are expected to play a significant role in the spectroscopic signatures recorded using optical techniques. The motivation of this work is to improve capabilities in wide area environmental sampling of nuclear materials, where this holds implications towards detecting undeclared nuclear fuel cycle activities and monitoring nuclear explosion events. At this time, 2 experiments have been performed on a cerium metal sample. 1, laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, or LIBS, and 2, time-resolved fast-gated imaging. LIBS is used to provide spectroscopic signatures of the plasma, while imaging is used to visualize the spatial structure of the emission of the plasma. Nanosecond laser ablation is used in both these experiments, and all experiments are also performed at atmospheric pressure. For the imaging experiments, filters are used to selectively image emission at certain wavelengths. We use 2 different filters, the first to image the atomic emission and the second to image molecular emission. These are the results of laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. The objective here was to identify strong cerium oxide bands that could be targeted for the imaging experiments. The 2 strongest transitions that were identified in the visible spectrum are the D1X1 transition as well as the D3X3 transition, where X1 here is referring to the ground state and all of the other states are higher energies than the ground state. The Q branch of the D1X1 transition is highlighted in green here, and that is because this is the peak that has been targeted for imaging molecular emission, because the band head of the molecular transition does not overlap with a peak for atomic transition. And one last thing, I do need to point out that On this slide, cerium oxide becomes visible in the spectrum at about 20 microseconds. It's likely that cerium oxide is also present at earlier times, yet is simply lost to the background at these times. Now, transitioning into the imaging experiments, this slide is illustrating the atomic emission in the plasma at various delay times for 3 different fill gases. Oxidation reactions should be present in air and absent in nitrogen and argon, where oxidation would reduce the intensity of atomic emission. This is clearly visible at 15,000 and 25,000 nanoseconds, where a faster decay in the total emission intensity in air is observed compared to nitrogen. Additionally, the shape of the plasma plume in argon differs from that of air and nitrogen, and this is due to the higher density of argon gas, which results in stronger confinement and stronger thermal emission. Now we are going to look at the spatial structure of the molecular emission. The first images of this are taken at 5,000 nanoseconds, where molecular emission is expected to be minimal or absent before this time based on LIBS results. I also need to acknowledge that atomic emission is a large contribution of the molecular emission signal recorded here at 5,000 and 15,000 nanoseconds. And this is because the filter we are currently using has a large bandwidth of 10 nanometers. I will discuss an option to address this later in the presentation. I also want to point out that these images are somewhat subjective based on how the user scales the images. Typically, each individual image is normalized to its own maximum, although that normalization process can vary between scientists. Unfortunately, relative intensities between the images can be lost during this process, which is why I've included this plot here on peak intensities at various delay times. This plot is showing you that pixel intensities corresponding to atomic emission are high at early times, yet decrease very quickly. Molecular emission is much stronger in the plasma at later times. Additionally, there is an oxide layer on our metal cerium sample. We do use cleaning shots to remove the surface oxidation. Overall, the oxygen in the sample appears to play a negligible role in the observed combustion in the plasma plume. Pulling you back to the introduction and background information, the expected impact of this work is to elucidate the mixing process of the plasma with the surrounding environment, which is directly related to the high temperature gas phase oxidation chemistry of actinide LPPs. This simulation here is one of the computational components of my dissertation research. I am using a multi-physics code called Highburn, which is a computational fluid dynamics code that has been designed specifically to model the shock physics and combustion chemistry of fireballs. This provides us direct insights into where atomic and molecular species in the fireball are located and how they are mixing with each other and the environment. So our interest in these simulations is to support our experimental results. That being said, these simulations are restricted to more common elements such as aluminum and titanium, and that's because a number of data inputs, including reaction rates, are required to run the code, and these reaction rates are not available for lanthanides and actinides at high temperatures that characterize laser-produced plasmas. Next steps for this work is to continue experiments to further elucidate the effect of bulk pressure on spectroscopic cerium LPP signatures and the effect of oxygen concentration on the spatiotemporal evolution of cerium LPPs. Part of this will involve repeating the experiments presented here on a cerium target in an inner atmosphere for various oxygen concentrations. We also have plans to order a custom bandpass filter with a more narrow bandwidth in order to target the molecular emission and reject more of the atomic emission during imaging. We do need to obtain this filter before we perform more time-resolved fast-gated imaging measurements in atmospheres containing oxygen. Some further updates on my education. I will be interning with the Department of Defense this upcoming summer. This is part of the DoD fellowship that I am funded through. I also have a number of upcoming conferences that I will be presenting at. I will be presenting an oral presentation at Mark in a few weeks. I believe a number of you in the audience today are also attending and presenting at this conference as well. Additionally, I have also been invited to present at the SciEx conference, which will be in October of 2022. And lastly, to highlight research collaborations with national laboratories, I am currently collaborating with Savannah River National Laboratory. This is where I plan to perform laser ablation and optical measurements on plutonium metal. In conclusion, this work has presented progress towards developing plutonium optical signatures using cerium LPP circuits. Cerium oxide bands were identified to investigate the oxidation chemistry of cerium LPPs, and time-resolved fast-gated imaging was performed to study the spatial structure and expansion dynamics of cerium LPPs. Pulling this back to the motivation, this work supports the NNSA mission by developing optical detection techniques to enable the remote sensing of actinides. Also, if you are interested in research plans and awards for myself and other students in my research group, this is a link for our website included here. And lastly, thank you to MTV and the NNSA for hosting and funding this research.